The high desert wind carried the scent of blood and burnt powder long before Grant Hayes saw the wagon. It was a dry, scouring wind, the kind that came down from the mountains in late October, promising a hard winter. He rode his horse, a solid buckskin gelding named Sully, with the easy posture of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. He was checking his trap lines, but trouble was the primary crop of the territory. He found the wreck in a shallow arroyo, 10 miles shy of the Santa Fe Trail. It had been a supply wagon for the railroad, now splintered and scorched, its canvas cover flapping like a broken wing. The mules were dead in their traces, throats cut. 2 men lay nearby, rough-looking and pale, their eyes wide with the surprise of meeting their maker so violently. Bandits had been thorough, splitting open sacks of flour and beans, taking whatever ammunition and whiskey they could find. Grant dismounted, rifle in hand, his gaze sweeping the rocks. Nothing moved. The raid was hours old. A sound, small and thin, cut through the wind. A scraping like iron on stone. He moved toward the back of the wagon, his steps quiet, and he saw her. She was chained to the rear axle. The chain was heavy, meant for livestock, and the iron cuff around her ankle was raw and bloody. She was a young Chinese woman, maybe 18 or 19. She wore the ragged remnants of a simple dress, stiff with dried blood from a gash on her forehead. When she saw his shadow fall over her, she flinched, a low sound of pure terror rattling in her chest, trying to scramble backward until the chain snapped her short. Grant stopped. He lowered the rifle. He saw the old bruises on her arms, the fresh terror in her eyes. The foreman who ran this wagon hadn't been protecting her, he had been using her or selling her. He holstered the rifle and moved slowly, holding his hands up, palms out. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I won't hurt you." She stared at him, her eyes bottomless, taking in his worn coat, the beard shadowing his jaw, the sadness he carried like a second skin. He went to his steel bag and pulled out his canteen and a heavy file. He offered the water first. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She drank, spilling half, her body shaking. When it was empty, Grant knelt by the chain. "This will make noise," he said, mostly to himself. He set the file to the iron link. Every rasp of the metal made her jump. It took him nearly 20 minutes, the sun beating on his back, until the link finally gave way with a sharp snap. She stared at the broken chain, then at him, as if she could not understand the concept of being free. "Can you stand?" he asked. She said nothing. He wasn't even sure if she understood him. When he reached for her, she recoiled, pulling her knees to her chest. "All right," he sighed. "I'm not them." He turned his back to her, a deliberate show of non-aggression, and rummaged in his bedroll. He came back with a strip of jerky and an old wool blanket, setting them down near her before walking 20 feet away to wait. It was a long time before she moved. First, she ate the jerky, tearing at it like a starved wolf. Then, slowly, she pulled herself to her feet. She looked at him, then at the vast, empty desert around them. There was nowhere to go. "You come with me, you'll be safe," Grant said, mounting Sully. "You stay here, you'll be dead by morning." Coyotes or the cold, he waited, knowing he should ride on. Taking her in was a fool's errand, borrowing a fight he didn't want. He looked at her again, at the high cheekbones and dark almond-shaped eyes. He wasn't in the arroyo anymore. He was 5 years gone, in a small cabin, watching his wife, Martha, her hand gripping his, her face pale with sweat as she lost her life, and that of their stillborn daughter. The Chinese girl in the dirt had that same look, a soul caught between worlds, belonging to neither. He was not a hero. He was just a man haunted. He could not save his wife, but he could not ride away from her ghost. "Come on," he said, his voice softer, holding out his hand. With halting, painful steps, her bare feet bleeding on the stones, she walked to him. She did not take his hand but stood beside the horse, waiting. Grant leaned down, hooked an arm around her waist, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He settled her in front of him, her back rigid against his chest, trembling so hard he could feel it in his own bones. He wrapped the old blanket around her and turned Sully's head toward the mountains. "You're safe," he whispered, to the wind or perhaps to himself. His homestead was high up, nestled in a small valley where the piñon pines gave way to aspen. It was isolated, a full day's ride from the nearest town, and that was how he liked it. The cabin was sturdy, built of timber he had cut himself. It was a lonely place, a place to forget. He slid off the horse and reached up for her. He carried her inside and set her down on the single chair by the cold hearth. The cabin was one room, a cot, a table, 2 chairs. The air was stale, smelling of old smoke and male solitude. The girl's eyes darted everywhere, measuring the dimensions of a new cage. "My name is Grant," he said, lighting the kindling in the fireplace. She said nothing. He warmed some water and approached to clean the cut on her forehead. She flinched, raising her hands to protect her face. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just cleaning the dirt," she hissed when the warm water touched the cut, but she let him clean it and apply a stinging salve. Her skin was hot, she had a fever. That night, she refused the cot. She unbolted the door and slipped outside into the freezing dark. Grant cursed under his breath, grabbing a blanket and following. She had huddled on the porch, her back against the cabin wall. He understood. The room had one door. He was a man. She had been in locked rooms with men before. He threw the blanket over her. "Stubborn," he muttered, leaving the door ajar. He sat in his chair by the fire and did not sleep. She was sick for 4 days. She woke in terror, shouting in a language he didn't know, fighting shadows. He held her down gently, forcing water and thin broth between her lips. He talked to her, the sound of his voice seeming to soothe her panic, telling her about the homestead, about his horse, about the weather. He did not talk about Martha. On the 5th day, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear, the terror replaced by a deep, bottomless caution. She was still wary of the cabin, so he found a compromise. The back porch was deep, used for storing wood. He spent 3 days enclosing it, sawing timber and sealing the cracks with mud and straw. He built a small, crude fireplace of river stone and clay, venting it through the roof. He moved the cot into the new room. It was small, but it was hers. It had its own door to the outside and a new wooden latch on the inside. When he was done, he showed it to her. He pointed to the latch. "Yours," he said. "You lock it." She touched the wooden latch, her expression unreadable. That night, for the first time, he heard the soft sound of the latch sliding into place. He began to gain her trust, not with words, but with routine. He left a plate of food on the porch rail 3 times a day, knocking before walking away to let her eat in private. He left small things where she would find them, the bar of soap, a comb he'd seen her trying to untangle her matted hair with her fingers, a hopeless task. He left a warm wool shawl, a deep red color, folded on her chair. That evening, he saw her sitting by her small fire, the shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Slowly, she began to emerge. Winter closed in. One morning he was splitting logs when he felt her watching. She pointed to the axe. "Aye," she said, the first word he'd heard her speak. It was hesitant, but it was a start. He showed her how to use the smaller axe for kindling. From then on, she began to mimic his chores, holding fence posts steady, taking a turn grinding corn. They worked side by side for weeks, the silence between them changing from tense and frightened to a shared, comfortable language of mutual labor. The homestead, which had been his prison of grief, began to feel like a shared space. One night, a brutal cold forced her into the main cabin for warmth. She sat on a bearskin rug by the fire. He was mending a bridle, his hands stiff. He had a puckered white scar on the back of his right hand from a brand during the war, and he rubbed it, a nervous habit. She crawled silently over and, with fingers as light as a moth's wing, traced the scar. The touch sent a jolt through him. He had not been touched with tenderness in 5 years. Her English was still broken, learned from listening to him mutter to his horse and himself. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Why," she asked, her voice soft, "does your heart sleep alone?" The question was a perfectly aimed arrow. He saw Martha's face in the fire, felt the phantom weight of a swaddled infant in his arms. He gently pulled his hand away and stood, turning to poke at the fire. "It's late," he said, his voice thick. "You should sleep." She slipped back into her own room, and he heard the soft slide of the latch. That night he dreamed of holding someone, of the simple, uncomplicated peace of not being alone, and woke to an ache in his chest sharper than any winter cold. The spring thaw finally came. The need for a real bath was overwhelming. Grant took his rifle and soaked down to a sheltered bend in the creek. The water was so cold it stole his breath. He was washing his hair, head dunked under the surface, when he came up and found her standing on the bank, holding his towel. "My, what are you doing here?" he yelled, stumbling back into deeper water, sinking to his shoulders. "Get back to the cabin." "You hunt," she said calmly, "but you bring soap. Go now." She did not go. She sat on a rock, her back to him, and waited. He was trapped. He stayed in the freezing water until his teeth were chattering and his feet were numb. Finally, he climbed out, wrapping the towel around his waist, shaking as much from anger as from cold. "You can't do that. A man needs privacy." "I see you every day," she said. "Why is this water different?" As he dressed, his fingers clumsy, she came closer. She knelt, her eyes fixed on his leg. He had forgotten about the scar. It was on his left thigh, a puckered, ugly knot of tissue where a Confederate mini-ball had torn through the muscle. Before he could react, she reached out and touched it. Her finger traced the edge of the wound. Then, she leaned down. Her black hair fell forward, brushing against his skin. She pressed her lips softly to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion. It was an act of acknowledgement, a reverence for the wound, for the fact that he had survived it. But it ripped through him like a bolt of lightning. "No," he yelled, jerking his leg back so fast he almost kicked her. "Don't ever do that." He grabbed his rifle and stalked back to the cabin, leaving her by the creek. That night, the fragile piece was shattered. He sat cleaning his rifle, pointedly ignoring her. Finally, she spoke from the shadows of her room. "The men before are the foreman. They hurt me." He closed his eyes. He had known, of course. They were white men. "They put their hands on me. When they were done, they sold me to the foreman." She came into the main room. It was cold. When they touched me, it was cold and hard, like stone. She looked at his shirt, at the place over his heart. "But not like you," she whispered. "You are warm." He wanted to hold her, to tell her that nothing cold would ever touch her again. But he knew with a sickening certainty that if he touched her now, he would be no different. She was a half-drowned woman reaching for a log, and he could not let her mistake that for love. "You are safe here, he said, his voice rough. "No one will hurt you." "I am safe," she said, looking up at him. "But I am not warm." She returned to her room, and this time he heard the wooden latch slide firmly into place. A week later, a violent spring storm brought the sky down to the earth. Rain and hail hammered the roof. Thunder cracked so close the cabin shuddered. The door to Mai's room flew open. She stood there, her eyes wide with terror, the storms of her childhood, the violence of men, all one and the same to her. She ran not to a chair, but to his cot where he had been preparing to sleep, scrambling onto it and burying her face in his blankets, her body shaking violently. He sighed, sitting on the edge of the cot, rubbing her back in a clumsy, paternal way. "It'll pass. It's just a storm." "Hold me," she whimpered, her voice muffled by the wool. He hesitated, but the cabin shook again and she cried out. He slid onto the cot, pulling her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her as he would a frightened child. He was still fully dressed. They lay like that for a long time. He had not held another person in 5 years and had forgotten what it felt like. He thought she had fallen asleep when she turned in his arms, her body flush against his, her face inches from his in the dark. "Grant," she whispered. "It's all right. Go to sleep." No, she pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "I want to feel what women feel." His blood went cold, then hot. No. This is not. "I want the warm," she insisted, her voice no longer frightened, but full of that same direct, honest curiosity. She pushed herself up, her lips near his. "I want to know." He stopped her, gripping her shoulders firmly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What those men did, they took something from you. What you're asking for now, it's not just the warm. This, between a man and a woman, it's supposed to be more. It's supposed to be a choice. A real one. Not one you make in the dark during a storm because you're scared or because you're grateful I'm not them. You deserve more than just heat, Mai. You deserve a choice. I will not be just another man who takes from you." She was silent, her body tense with incomprehension. She was offering the only thing she felt she had, and he was refusing it. She pulled away, slid off the cot and, without a word, went back to her room, quietly closing the door. He did not hear the latch. He lay awake until dawn, his body aching with a tension that was both desire and shame. He had done the right thing, protected her even from herself. But as the first grey light filled the cabin, he felt more alone than ever. He must have drifted off, because he woke to the smell of coffee and smoke. He dreaded facing her, expecting her to be gone, or worse, to have retreated back into a silent, weary ghost. He got up and splashed cold water on his face. He opened the cabin door. Mai was outside, feeding the 2 chickens a handful of cracked corn. The morning air was washed clean, and the sun was bright. She seemed calm, her movements deliberate. He was about to speak, to apologize, to try and explain again, when he stopped. She was wearing one of his old, threadbare flannel shirts. It was enormous on her, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, the hem brushing her knees. And she was humming. It was a low, repetitive, tuneless sound, a sound of pure, unthinking contentment. She was swaying with the rhythm of scattering the corn, her body lost in the motion. She looked up and saw him watching her. She did not flush. She did not look away. She just smiled. A small, slow smile that lit her eyes. He had seen her curious. He had seen her terrified. He had seen her angry. He had never, in all this time, seen her truly happy. The image of her, barefoot and wearing his shirt, humming in his home, was the most profoundly domestic thing he had ever witnessed. It stunned him. It was a vision of a life he had buried 5 years ago. He walked to her. He didn't know what he was going to say. He reached out and touched her hair, then her cheek. "Mai," he whispered. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The tension, the longing he had fought for so many months was suddenly unbearable. He bent his head, intending to finally kiss her. She stopped him, her hand coming up to his chest. "Wait," she whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, not with fear but with that same devastating curiosity he had seen before, yet this time her voice was fragile, uncertain. "So," she asked, her voice barely audible, "that's how cowboys have sex? Can I please try?" He felt the world tilt. The innocence of the request and the profound, bone-deep need behind it. She was not asking for sex. She was asking for a child, a family, a life, everything that had been stolen from her, everything he had lost. He was overwhelmed by his own longing, a desire so fierce it was almost painful. But he thought of his promise. He thought of the storm. He gripped her arms. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice raw. "Mai, this is forever. This is not a game. Are you sure?" She did not hesitate. She looked at him, her soul in her eyes. She put her hand against his scarred, bruised cheek. "I am sure," she whispered. Her yes was a whisper against his mouth. He kissed her. He lifted her, his hands buried in the soft flannel of his shirt, and carried her to his cot. It was nothing like his dreams. It was awkward. Their limbs were clumsy. He was rough from 5 years of solitude, she was hesitant, her only knowledge born of violence. But it was also a revelation, a raw, desperate hunger to erase the cold, to claim a piece of life in a world that had offered them only death. He was gentle. He was tender. He whispered her name over and over, like a prayer. And she was not the victim he had feared she would be. She was not passive. She was active. She was curious. She was strong. In her own way, she was healing him. When it was over, they lay tangled in the blankets, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window. He held her, his heart too full to speak. He had crossed the line. He had broken every rule. She lay against his chest, her ear over his heart. She was quiet for a long time. So, she whispered, her voice sleepy, "That is how it is warm." He kissed the top of her head, his eyes closing. "Yes," he said. "It's warm."